1985. In that calendar year alone, a 747 was ripped apart over the Atlantic Ocean. A microburst struck a TriStar plane to the ground in Dallas, and by the end of that year, almost 2,000 people were gone. No year before it and no year since has come close. This is the story of the worst year ever in aviation history. The Lockheed Electra was 25 years old, a 4-engine turboprop built in 1960, the kind of airplane that most major airlines had retired a decade earlier. Galaxy Airlines still flew it. On the night of January 21st, 1985, that Electra was parked at Reno Cannon International Airport, waiting to carry 65 passengers and 6 crew to Minneapolis. Most of the passengers were Minnesota football fans coming back from a Super Bowl gambling weekend at Caesars Tahoe. It was just past 1 in the morning. The trouble was already built into the airplane before it moved an inch. During the engine start sequence on the ground, Reno Flying Service handled the procedure using hand signals after discovering their radio was not working. In the confusion, an air start access door on one of the engines was left unlatched. It was a small panel, roughly the size of a magazine, but in flight, it would catch the airstream and begin to vibrate. Nobody checked it. Nobody noticed. Flight 203 lifted off from runway 16 right and began climbing into the dark Nevada sky. Within seconds, the cockpit began to shake. A low-frequency vibration ran through the airframe, strong enough to rattle the instruments. The captain's first instinct was that something was wrong with one of the 4 Allison turboprops. He pulled the power back. The first officer, who was flying, did not compensate by adjusting airspeed. At roughly 250 feet above the ground, with all 4 engines now producing reduced thrust, the captain requested a left turn back to the airport. The tower cleared them immediately, but the Electra was no longer climbing. With the throttles pulled back and the airplane in a banked turn at low altitude, airspeed bled away fast. The aircraft began to sink in a nose-high attitude. The stall was coming, and neither pilot recognized it in time. A crew member grabbed the cabin loudspeaker and announced to the passengers that they were going to crash. Screaming filled the cabin. The pilots shoved the throttles forward, trying to get the engines back to full power, but the Electra was already too slow and too low. At 1:04 a.m., barely 2 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft hit an open field along South Virginia Street, about 1.5 miles from the runway, and broke apart. Debris scattered across the road, into an RV dealership, and onto parked vehicles. What followed the impact was worse than the impact itself. Pathologists who later examined the victims found that the majority had survived the initial crash. They did not survive what came after. Ruptured fuel lines fed a fire that swept through the wreckage, and toxic smoke filled the broken fuselage. People who were alive and conscious after hitting the ground were overcome before they could move. 68 people were confirmed dead at the scene. 2 more died in the hospital over the following days. 1 person lived. 17-year-old George Lamson Jr. had been seated in the cabin when the Electra came apart. The force of the breakup threw him roughly 40 feet from the wreckage, still strapped into his seat. He landed upright on the pavement of South Virginia Street, conscious, burned and bleeding, but alive. A firefighter reached him within minutes and began first aid. Lamson spent 8 days in the hospital and was later released to his mother. He would go on to testify before the National Transportation Safety Board that April, describing what he remembered from the inside of an airplane that went from routine to fatal in under 2 minutes. The investigation pointed to a chain of small failures lining up in the worst possible order. A broken radio on the ground led to hand signals. Hand signals led to an unsecured access door. The open door caused vibrations the crew could not identify. The crew's response, pulling power back on all 4 engines during a low-altitude climb, drained the airspeed that was keeping them in the air. The National Transportation Safety Board called it pilot error, specifically the failure to monitor and maintain adequate airspeed after reducing thrust. The unsecured door was listed as a contributing factor. In response, the Federal Aviation Administration, the agency responsible for overseeing aviation safety in the United States, issued a mandatory modification order for the air start access doors on all remaining Lockheed Electras in service. Galaxy Airlines Flight 203 was the first major air disaster of 1985. It happened 21 days into the year. No one knew it at the time, but it was only the beginning. 2 words, repeated, impossible to ignore, unless the crew decides it means something else. Iberia Flight 610 was a Boeing 727 on a short domestic hop from Madrid to Bilbao, in Spain's northern Basque country. February 19, 1985. 141 passengers and 7 crew. The flight had already been delayed on the ground at Madrid for reasons that were never fully clarified. Some reports mentioned a security check, others pointed to a late arriving passenger. By the time the 727 finally pushed back, the crew was behind schedule, and the weather at Bilbao was deteriorating. Visibility down to about 4 kilometers. It was going to be an instrument approach all the way in. The captain was José Luis Patiño. The first officer was Lopez. Under normal crew resource management, the captain should have been monitoring the instruments, calling out altitudes every 1,000 feet, and handling communications with Bilbao approach. Instead, something unusual happened. From the moment the descent began, Captain Patiño went almost completely silent. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed that he barely spoke during the entire approach. The first officer was left doing 2 jobs at once, flying the airplane and talking to air traffic control, while the man in the left seat, who was supposed to be cross-checking altitude, heading and rate of descent, simply did not participate. The first officer contacted Bilbao Tower and received clearance to descend for the approach. The crew set their target altitude and began coming down through the clouds on autopilot. Between them and the airport sat Mount Oise, a ridge hidden in the fog. The 727 had a system that was supposed to automatically level the airplane off at the safe altitude. Investigators later concluded that the crew either forgot to arm it, accidentally switched it off, or the system failed on its own. Whatever the reason, when the airplane reached the altitude where it should have stopped descending, it kept going. The 727 sank below the minimum safe height and continued down into terrain that neither pilot could see. The ground proximity warning system activated. The alarm sounded in the cockpit. This was the moment that should have saved everyone on board. But Captain Patiño, who had been silent for the entire approach, apparently mistook the warning for a routine alert telling him they had reached their target altitude. He ignored it. The first officer, overwhelmed with flying and talking to the tower at the same time, did not challenge him. No one pulled back on the controls. The 727 kept descending. Seconds later, the aircraft struck a television antenna on the summit of Mount Oise, an obstacle that was not even marked on the crew's charts. The impact tore off the left wing. The 727 rolled, cartwheeled, and plunged into a forested ravine. The fuselage disintegrated down the mountainside. All 148 people on board were killed. Rescue teams reached the crash site to find wreckage and remained scattered across steep terrain, still shrouded in the fog that had hidden the peak from the crew. The impact was so violent that only 49 victims could be identified in the days that followed. 7 were never identified and were buried together in Bilbao. The investigation called it controlled flight into terrain. The airplane was working perfectly. The engines were fine. The crew simply flew a functioning aircraft into a mountain they did not know was there, because a captain stopped paying attention. An alarm was misread, and a button that should have been pressed never was. After Flight 610, Spanish authorities ordered every airline in the country to replace the old-style altimeters with modern displays that were harder to misread. It was the 3rd fatal crash in Spain in less than 15 months, and the last one for over 2 decades. The era of flying into mountains because of an ambiguous dial and an unpressed button was ending. But for 148 people over the Basque Country that February morning, it ended too late. Captain Ted Connors could see the thunderstorm. So could First Officer Rudy Price. It was right there on the weather radar, and it was right there through the windshield. A dark column of rain hanging beneath a cumulonimbus cell just north of the runway at Dallas-Fort Worth. August 2nd, 1985. The kind of brutal Texas summer afternoon that breeds storms fast. Connors had over 16,000 hours in his logbook. Price and flight engineer Nick Nassick were veterans too, all 3 of them former military pilots. Between them, more than 42,000 hours of flying experience. They had seen weather like this before. They decided to fly through it. Delta Flight 191 was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the big wide-body Tri-Js that dominated long-haul domestic routes in the 80s. It had left Fort Lauderdale that afternoon with 152 passengers and 11 crew, bound for Los Angeles with a stop in Dallas. The flight was routine until they began their descent into North Texas and the radar started painting cells ahead. At 5:43 in the afternoon, air traffic control cleared them down to 10,000 feet and offered a heading to keep them clear of the weather. Connors looked at the radar return and told the controller he could see a pretty good-sized cell and would rather not go through it. He was given an alternate heading, but as the approach continued, another cell developed directly along the final approach path to the runway. Other pilots on the ground at Dallas-Fort Worth were watching it build. At 6:04, with the TriStar descending through about 1,500 feet, Price spotted lightning directly ahead and called it out. Connors asked where. Price said right ahead of us. Neither pilot broke off the approach. The airplane continued toward the range shaft at 149 knots, configured for landing, gear down, flaps extended. 12 seconds before impact with the ground, what was hiding inside that curtain of rain reached out and grabbed the airplane. A microburst is a concentrated column of sinking air that punches out of the base of a thunderstorm and hits the ground, spreading outward like water from an open faucet striking a flat surface. The TriStar was sinking at over 1,500 feet per minute. Connors called for full power. Price shoved the throttles forward, but the airplane kept falling. At 6:05 and 30 seconds, the TriStar touched down in a field about a mile short of the runway, bounced, became briefly airborne again, then slammed back down, still sliding at over 200 miles per hour. The wreckage hit two large water storage tanks near the airport perimeter. The aircraft broke apart and erupted into fire. Debris scattered across the highway and into the fields on both sides. Of the 163 people on board, 136 were gone. 27 survived, many with severe injuries. Among those lost was Don Estridge, the IBM engineer credited as the father of the personal computer, along with his wife. What made the crash so devastating for the industry was that it was not the first time. Between 1964 and 1985, over 30 accidents and incidents in the United States had been linked to the same phenomenon. More than 500 people had already been lost to it. Eastern Airlines Flight 66 in New York in 1975, Pan Am 759 in Louisiana in 1982. Each time, investigators said the same thing. Wind shear near the ground during approach or takeoff, with no reliable way to detect it in real time. And each time, the technology to fix the problem was still in development, still being tested, still not required. Seven years before the crash, the airplane that would become Japan Airlines Flight 123 was already damaged. In 1978, the same Boeing 747 had struck its tail during a hard landing at Osaka. The rear pressure bulkhead, a curved wall separating the pressurized cabin from the unpressurized tail, was cracked. Boeing sent a repair team. The approved method called for a single continuous metal plate secured with 3 rows of rivets. What the technicians actually installed was 2 separate pieces, one attached with only a single row. That shortcut reduced the bulkhead's resistance to metal fatigue by roughly 30%. The inspection missed it. The airplane went back into service and flew 12,000 more flights over the next 7 years without anyone knowing the wall at the back of the cabin was slowly cracking apart. August 12, 1985 was the eve of Obon, a Japanese holiday when families travel home to honor their ancestors. The 747 was packed, 524 people, most of them headed to Osaka to be with family. Captain Masami Takahama was in the right seat, supervising First Officer Sasaki on one of his final training flights before promotion. 12 minutes after takeoff, climbing through 24,000 feet over Sagami Bay, the bulkhead gave way. Pressurized air blasted through the ruptured wall into the tail section with enough force to rip the vertical stabilizer off the airplane. That same surge tore through every hydraulic line routed through the tail. In an instant, all 4 independent hydraulic systems were gone. The flight controls went dead. The rudder was gone. The crew of Flight 123 had an aircraft the size of a building with no way to steer it. What followed was 32 minutes of flying that engineers later said should not have been possible. With no hydraulics, the only tools left were the engine throttles. By adding power on one side and reducing it on the other, the crew could coax the 747 into rough turns. But the airplane had entered violent oscillations, pitching up and down while rolling side to side. Passengers were thrown against their seats. Oxygen masks dropped. Many understood what was happening. Some began writing farewell notes on boarding passes and napkins. A father wrote to his children to work together and take care of their mother. Controllers cleared them to return to Tokyo and offered a closer military base. But the 747 could not hold a steady heading long enough to line up with any runway. For half an hour, the aircraft drifted northwest, sometimes plunging over 1,000 feet in seconds before the pilots clawed it back with engine power. At 6:56 p.m., the 747 struck a ridge near Mount Takamagahara in Gunma Prefecture. The aircraft hit the trees, cartwheeled across the mountainside, and broke apart. 520 people were gone. 4 passengers survived, all seated near the rear. One of them, an off-duty cabin crew member, later described hearing voices in the darkness after impact, people who were alive, calling out. Then one by one, the voices stopped. A military helicopter flew over the crash site that night. The crew concluded there were no survivors and turned back. Ground rescue teams did not arrive until the following morning. By then, between 20 and 50 passengers who had likely survived the impact had perished from injuries and exposure in the mountain cold overnight. Investigators calculated that the bulkhead should have failed after roughly 10,000 pressurization cycles. It lasted over 12,000. For 7 years, every passenger who boarded that airplane sat in front of a wall that was slowly losing its ability to hold. After Flight 123, Boeing reinforced the pressure bulkheads on all 747s and redesigned the hydraulic routing so that a single tail failure could never again sever every system at once. Japan Airlines built a permanent safety center at Haneda, displaying the recovered bulkhead for every new employee as a reminder that a shortcut in a repair bay can take 7 years to reach the cockpit. 40 years later, the farewell notes are still preserved. Some families visit the mountain every August 12th. The ridge has a name now. They call it Osutaka. The airplane never left the ground. That is the detail that makes this disaster so difficult to accept. British Air Tours Flight 28. Mike never climbed, never cruised, never lost an engine at altitude. It was parked on a taxiway at Manchester Airport with all its wheels on the concrete when 55 people inside it lost their lives, not from impact, from what the cabin itself became once the fire got in. August 22nd, 1985. 131 passengers, most of them British families, headed to Corfu for a summer holiday, boarded a Boeing 737 at 6 in the morning. The first officer advanced the throttles. At 80 knots, the captain made his standard call-out. 12 seconds later, a loud thud shook the airframe. The captain's first thought was a burst tire. He called stop and began slowing down. The 737 had reached 126 knots. It was under control, still on the runway. From the cockpit, this looked manageable. It was not. Deep inside the left engine, a combustion chamber that had been improperly repaired months earlier had ruptured. A piece of the chamber wall punched outward and fractured an access panel on the underside of the left wing. Fuel began pouring from the tank and ignited almost immediately. A curtain of fire trailed behind the engine as the 737 rolled off the runway and stopped. A light breeze pushed the flames directly along the fuselage toward the rear of the cabin. The airplane was stationary, the engines were off, but the fuselage was being cooked from outside in. The captain ordered an evacuation. Passengers near the front began getting out through the forward door, but the rear of the cabin was already filling with dense black smoke. The seat cushions, carpet, and plastic wall panels were made of materials that released hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide when heated, gases that could knock a person unconscious in seconds. Passengers at the back could not see the aisle. Some crawled over seat backs toward the overwing exits, the emergency hatches that were supposed to provide a second escape route. Those exits failed the people who needed them most. The gap between seats at the overwing row was barely 27 centimeters wide. The hatch weighed over 20 kilograms and fell inward onto a passenger when released. The opening was directly over a seat, forcing people to twist their bodies through an awkward space while smoke poured over them. Investigators later found 38 bodies clustered around that single exit. Some had reached the opening. Some had collapsed in the aisle trying to get there. A 14-year-old boy was the last person pulled alive through that hatch. 5.5 minutes after the airplane stopped, lying on top of a man who had not survived. 2 cabin crew members, Sharon Ford and Jackie Urbanski, had stayed at their posts in the rear trying to direct passengers out. Both were among those who did not make it. 82 people survived, 55 did not. The investigation found that the majority had not been burned. They had been overcome by toxic fumes from the materials lining the cabin they were sitting in. The official report treated the fatalities as a separate question from the engine failure. Why did 55 people in a stationary airplane, with fire crews arriving within minutes, not survive? The answer was the cabin itself. The materials were lethally toxic when they burned. The exits were too narrow. The aisle became a bottleneck. Floor-level visibility dropped to 0 within a minute. The changes that followed reshaped every commercial cabin in the world. Seat cushions and panels were replaced with fire-resistant materials that produced far less toxic smoke. Emergency floor-level lighting was installed so passengers could find exits in 0 visibility. Overwing exit rows were widened. Armrests near exits were redesigned to fold away. Passengers in those rows began receiving mandatory briefings before every flight. Modern aircraft must now pass a full evacuation test. Everyone out in 90 seconds in the dark before they are certified to carry a single passenger. Every time you board a flight and notice the extra legroom at the exit row, or see the small lights running along the cabin floor, or hear a crew member ask if you are willing and able to operate the emergency exit, that is Manchester. That is Flight 28, Mike. Aero Air Flight 1285 was a Douglas DC-8, a 4-engine jet built in 1969, chartered by the military because the route from Cairo to Fort Campbell was too long for a single leg. The airplane had already flown from Cairo to Cologne, where a fresh crew took over, and then to Gander International Airport in Newfoundland for a final refueling stop. It landed just before 6 in the morning on December 12th. The temperature was -12 degrees. Light freezing drizzle had been falling. The soldiers stayed on board while the aircraft was fueled. No de-icing was performed. At 6:45, still dark, the DC-8 began its takeoff roll. 51 seconds in, the nose lifted off the pavement, and right there, witnesses could see something was wrong. The airplane struggled to gain height, barely clearing the ground, speed bleeding off instead of building. Drivers on the Trans-Canada Highway just past the runway looked up and saw the aircraft crossing above them at an impossibly low altitude. Some reported a bright glow from beneath the fuselage. Then, the DC-8 pitched nose up, still sinking, and struck the ground in a wooded area half a mile beyond the runway. It broke apart and erupted into a fire fed by a full load of fuel. All 256 people on board were gone. A Canadian military police corporal named Robert Smith was one of the first to reach the site. He later said nothing had prepared him for what he found. Christmas presents were scattered through the wreckage, letters, photographs, gifts wrapped for children who were waiting at Fort Campbell, all mixed with the debris of a destroyed airplane. At Fort Campbell, hundreds of families preparing for homecoming celebrations were told instead that the flight had gone down with no survivors. 4 days later, President Reagan flew to the base for a memorial service. He called the soldiers peacemakers. It was the single worst day in the history of the Screaming Eagles. The investigation that followed tore Canada's aviation safety system apart. The cockpit voice recorder had a technical fault and produced almost nothing. The flight data recorder yielded only limited information. The wreckage was shattered beyond what most investigators had seen. The Canadian Aviation Safety Board split into two camps that never reconciled. The majority concluded that the DC-8 had likely accumulated ice on its wings during the ground stop. Freezing drizzle, no de-icing, and a possibly underestimated weight combined to produce a situation where the wings could not generate enough lift. The airplane stalled within seconds of leaving the runway. 4 dissenting members disagreed completely. They believed the evidence pointed to a fire or a vent before the airplane hit the ground, possibly in the cargo hold. The witnesses who reported a glow, the wreckage pattern, and certain forensic details led them to suggest something other than ice. Some outside observers speculated about sabotage, given that the airplane was carrying military personnel from a sensitive region. No conclusive evidence was ever produced, but the suspicion never fully disappeared. The split was so bitter that it destroyed the credibility of the safety board itself. Canada shut it down in 1990 and replaced it with a new independent agency. The disagreement also delayed reforms to de-icing procedures. 4 years later, ice brought down another aircraft under similar winter conditions in Canada, and investigators noted the changes that might have prevented it had been stalled by the unresolved argument over Gander. Aero Air Flight 1285 was the last major disaster of 1985. It happened on December 12th, with less than 3 weeks left in a year that had already lost nearly 2,000 lives to aviation. And it ended the way the worst years always seem to end. Not with a resolution, but with one more loss that nobody saw coming on a frozen runway in Newfoundland, 13 days before Christmas. Nobody on the ground heard a distress call. There was no mayday, no warning, no final transmission from the cockpit. At 7:14 in the morning on June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182 simply vanished from the radar screen at Shannon Control in Ireland. 1 second, the target was there, cruising at 31,000 feet over the Atlantic. The next second, it was gone. Attempts to reach the aircraft by radio went unanswered. An hour and 40 minutes before its scheduled landing at London Heathrow, a Boeing 747 named Emperor Kanishka, carrying 329 people, had ceased to exist. The flight had begun the previous evening in Toronto. Passengers boarded for what was supposed to be a long but routine trip to India, with stops in Montreal and London, before continuing to Delhi and finally Mumbai. The cabin was full of families. 268 of the passengers were Canadian citizens, most of them of Indian descent. What none of them knew was that a suitcase in the cargo hold did not belong to anyone on the airplane. It had been checked in at Vancouver Airport the day before, tagged through to the Air India flight, but the person who checked it in never boarded. The bag made its way from Vancouver to Toronto, was transferred onto Flight 182 in Montreal, and sat in the forward cargo hold as the 747 climbed out over the Atlantic. Canadian security had a device at the airport designed to detect certain materials in luggage. During screening, the machine produced a brief, low-volume alert near the zipper of a soft-sided maroon suitcase. The operators did not know what to do with a short beep. They had not been trained on how to respond to a partial reading. They let the bag through. At 31,000 feet, somewhere off the southwest coast of Ireland, the contents of that suitcase detonated. The fuselage was torn open. The 747 broke apart in midair and fell in pieces into the North Atlantic. The water was over 6,000 feet deep. All 329 people on board were lost. Recovery ships reached the area within hours, but the scene offered almost nothing to hold on to. Debris floated on the surface, seat cushions, luggage, fragments of clothing. Bodies were scattered across miles of open ocean. Only 131 were recovered. The rest sank with the wreckage into water so deep that reaching the aircraft required specialized submersibles. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were eventually located on the ocean floor and brought to the surface in early July, confirming what investigators already suspected. The aircraft had been intact and functioning normally until the moment it was torn apart from within. The same morning, at Tokyo's Narita Airport on the other side of the world, a suitcase that had arrived on a Canadian Pacific flight from Vancouver detonated in the baggage transfer area. 2 Japanese baggage handlers were lost. Investigators eventually determined that both events were connected, planned by the same group, members of a Sikh separatist organization operating out of Canada. The second device had been intended for another Air India flight to Bangkok. The timing was off by a matter of hours because the planners failed to account for the time zone difference between Canada and Japan. For Canada, the disaster exposed a failure that went far beyond one unchecked suitcase. The country's 2 main security agencies, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, had both been watching the individuals involved for months. Wiretaps had been running. Informants were in place. But the 2 agencies were locked in what a later government inquiry called turf wars. They did not share information with each other. Critical surveillance recordings were later destroyed by intelligence officers who said they were protecting their sources. A 2010 commission concluded that Canadian authorities had enough information to identify the flight as a high-risk target, but institutional rivalries and bureaucratic failures meant the dots were never connected. The legal aftermath stretched across decades. Only one person was ever convicted in connection with the attack, a man who pleaded guilty to manslaughter in 2003 and received 5 years. The suspected mastermind was never tried in Canada. He returned to India and was shot during a police encounter in 1992. 2 other men were acquitted in 2005. For the families, the result felt less like justice and more like a second loss. 98 people were on board, 60 did not survive, and most of them were not taken by the men who seized the airplane. They were taken by the operation that was supposed to save them. Egypt Air Flight 648, a Boeing 737, lifted off from Athens at 8 in the evening on November 23, 1985, bound for Cairo. 10 minutes into the flight, 3 armed men stood up. They were members of the Abu Nidal organization, a Palestinian militant faction carrying firearms and grenades. One went straight for the cockpit. Another positioned himself at the rear. The third, their leader, began walking the aisle, checking passports. What the group did not know was that an Egyptian plainclothes security officer named Mustafa Kamal was sitting among the passengers. When the situation became clear, Kamal drew his weapon and fired, taking down the group's leader. But the other 2 fired back. Kamal was hit. 2 flight attendants were wounded, and the gunfire punctured the fuselage, causing rapid cabin depressurization. The pilots had no choice but to descend immediately, dropping 14,000 feet so passengers could breathe. The airplane was now damaged, losing pressure, carrying wounded people and 2 remaining armed men who had just watched their leader get shot. The original plan had been Libya. With the aircraft in the condition it was in, that was no longer possible. Omar Razak, who took over command, ordered the pilots to divert to Malta. Maltese authorities refused permission to land. The runway lights at Lucca Airport were switched off. The pilots landed anyway, putting the damaged 737 down in the dark. Once on the ground, the Maltese military surrounded the airplane. What followed was a 24-hour standoff that deteriorated hour by hour. The Maltese Prime Minister came to the airport control tower and tried to negotiate directly. Razak demanded fuel and safe passage. Malta refused to refuel the aircraft. Razak responded by announcing he would execute a passenger every 15 minutes until his demands were met. He started with the Israeli and American passport holders. One by one, passengers were dragged to the forward door and shot on the stairway. Some survived their wounds, others did not. The Maltese government held firm, telling Razak that if the airplane left Malta, American fighter jets based in Italy would intercept it. Behind the scenes, an Egyptian commando unit had been flown to the island. The plan was to storm the airplane in the early hours. But the assault came earlier than scheduled, and with a level of force that investigators later called excessive. The commandos used over 2 kilograms of military-grade plastic explosive to blow open the doors and the luggage hold beneath the fuselage. The blast did far more than open a path inside. It ignited the plastic interior panels of the cabin, filling the aircraft with thick toxic fumes in seconds. Passengers who had survived the entire standoff, who had sat for hours in fear, who were still alive and conscious in their seats, were overcome before they could move. Accounts of what happened inside during those final minutes remain disputed. The Maltese Prime Minister said the explosives used by the commandos caused the cabin materials to catch fire, leading to mass suffocation. Other sources, including the local press, reported that when the attackers realized the aircraft was being stormed, they threw grenades into the passenger rows, adding to the chaos and the fire. What is not disputed is the outcome. When it was over, 56 of the 86 passengers were gone. 2 of the 3 armed men were gone as well, along with 2 crew members. Many of those who perished were women and children. The forensic investigation later confirmed that the majority did not die from gunfire. They suffocated. Omar Razak survived. He had been shot during the raid but managed to crawl out of the cockpit. He was tried in Malta, sentenced to 25 years, but released after 7. He was later rearrested in Nigeria and extradited to the United States, where he was convicted of air piracy and sentenced to life in a federal prison, where he remains. Until September 11, 2001, Egypt Air Flight 648 held a grim record. It was the deadliest aircraft seizure in history. But the lesson it left behind was not just about the men who took the airplane. It was about what happens when the rescue itself becomes the catastrophe. A commando operation designed to save lives used more force than the airframe and its passengers could absorb. The people inside, who had endured hours of fear, who had heard gunfire and watched fellow passengers dragged to the door, were ultimately overwhelmed not by the men holding them captive, but by the smoke and fire that followed the attempt to free them. 1985 had already delivered more than enough grief to the aviation world. Flight 648, coming just 3 months before the year ended, added one more lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a crisis is the moment someone decides it is over. 1985 began with a turboprop breaking apart in a field outside Reno on a freezing January night. It ended with a chartered jet full of soldiers falling into the woods at Gander 13 days before Christmas. In between, the year took a 747 over the Atlantic, another into a Japanese mountainside, a TriStar into the Texas dirt, a 737 that never made it off the ground in Manchester, and a 737 that became a death trap on a runway in Malta. Nearly 2,000 people, gone in 12 months. Guinness World Records still lists it as the deadliest year in the history of commercial aviation. No year before or since has come close. But the year did leave something behind. After Dallas, airports installed terminal Doppler weather radar, and pilots were trained for the first time to recognize and escape microbursts. After Japan, Boeing reinforced the pressure bulkheads on every 747 in the world and redesigned how hydraulic lines were routed through the tail. After Manchester, the inside of every commercial cabin was rebuilt with fire-resistant materials, wider exit rows, and floor-level emergency lighting. After Gander, Canada eventually replaced its entire aviation safety board with a new independent agency. Every one of those changes is still in place today. Every one of them exists because of what happened in 1985. The people who boarded those flights did not know they were part of a historic year. The families headed to Corfu for summer, the students flying home for Oban, the football fans coming back from a weekend in Reno, the soldiers counting the hours until Fort Campbell. They were ordinary passengers on ordinary days, and the thing that connected all of them is that somewhere between the gate and the destination, a system that was supposed to protect them failed. Aviation is safer now than it has ever been. That is true. But every regulation in the book, every sensor in the cockpit, every procedure in the manual was written because something went wrong first. 1985 wrote more of those lessons into the system than any other year in history. The cost of those lessons was measured in lives, in families that never recovered, in communities that still hold memorial services 40 years later. If there is anything useful to take from a year this painful, it is that the people who died in 1985 did not disappear without consequence. The skies got safer because of them. Not fast enough, and never soon enough for the ones who were already gone, but safer. If you want to keep learning how and why these things happened, and what changed because of them, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one.